In the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the distinctive smell of sterilizing agents, hospitals already hold considerable amount of despair, hopelessness, and sheer terror stemming from the confrontation of our own mortality. Within these walls, where the vulnerability of human existence truly comes to light, ordinary moments can take on an eerie hue. However, this collection of stories rather delves into the unexplainable, into terrors that may linger in places our medical and scientific knowledge hasn't quite managed to reach yet. From ghastly apparitions to situations that go beyond our known world, these stories will take us deep into the realm between life and death. To ensure you don't miss out on other horror contents, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Story 1. I work part-time at a restaurant for about a year now. I'm one of the cooks, which means that since the place I work in only opens in the afternoon, I'm usually finishing my day at around 1 a.m. at the latest. Not ideal if you have something else planned for the night. That was just my case this one time. I'd been invited to a party on a Friday night, and some friends wanted to meet to pregame at one of their places. Unfortunately, I had also been assigned a shift that day, which meant that around 12 a.m. I was rushing to clean up my station and pick everything up to try to make it out as soon as possible. However, all that rushing led me to being pretty careless, which meant that when I was just about to be done, I accidentally ended up slicing my finger pretty badly with the knife I was trying to dry. I tried applying pressure with some gauze of our emergency kit, but the bleeding simply wasn't stopping. So, with the slight hope that I'd be fixed up and ready to go before the party ended, I bandaged the finger as best as I could and headed to the emergency room of the nearest hospital, just in case I'd be needing stitches. I arrived at around 1 a.m. and was greeted by a pale bright light, illuminating a closed glass door with an intercom right next to it. I pressed the button and was answered by a nurse clearly not in her best mood, who buzzed me in after explaining why I was there. I was made to fill some forms and provide my insurance number, and then sent straight to the waiting room with some more gauze to change my already pretty bloody bandage. They were clearly understaffed and busy with a more pressing emergency, so I'd be made to wait until someone could look me over. Annoyed and trying to ignore my bleeding finger, I sat down in the empty waiting room. Have you ever been to the ER in the late hours of the night? I can imagine that if it's full, it's gotta be quite a chaotic environment. But that time it was completely empty, and it felt so quiet. Well, besides from the pained moans that seeped through from somewhere, which just added to the unsettling atmosphere, the whole place looks and feels like it's ready for a constant pandemonium. So when it isn't full of people, it's almost like it's dormant, awaiting something. And then that something arrives. It must have been an hour already that I'd been sitting in the waiting room completely by myself when the buzzer from the door rang. I was sitting on a far corner of the waiting room, holding my increasingly bloodier bandage tightly, so I couldn't see who could be standing outside. I simply ignored it, assuming that a nurse or medic would eventually come to check, but they didn't. The buzzer rang again, and I kept on waiting, but no one seemed like they were gonna show up. There was only absolute silence. I immediately got a very bad feeling. I couldn't really explain why, but my whole began slowly tensing up, and I felt a chill running down my back. The buzzer rung a third time, and I couldn't just keep ignoring it. What if it was someone that really needed immediate help? I got up and began calling for someone, yelling that there was someone at the door, but still, no one came. I turned around and saw the person standing at the other side for the first time. I almost jumped. It was a young woman, badly beaten up. Bruises and welts covered almost her entire face as well as her arms, and she was struggling to stay on her feet as she held her hand to a profusely bleeding wound in her stomach, the blood dripping slowly from her hand to the floor. As soon as she saw me, she began banging the door desperately, crying, begging me to let her in. I began trying to reassure her, telling her I was gonna go get someone immediately, but she just began banging the door even harder. There was something that was really unsettling about her. a strange glint to her eyes, the sheer desperation of her movements. But I couldn't think about it too hard at the moment. She clearly needed help. I made my way into the other side of the front desk and began looking for the button that had buzzed the door open. Meanwhile, the woman began shouting, louder and louder each time, her voice getting raw. Finally, I found it, and was just about to press it when a nurse burst into the room. She yelled at me to stop, and startled, I began trying to explain the situation to her, telling her about the woman waiting outside, but she just demanded that I step away from the button and return to my seat. I got really angry at her aggressiveness when I was clearly just trying to help, but she interrupted me halfway and told me to check the door again. I did. It was empty. No trace of the woman. Even the blood she'd dripped on the floor was gone. Confused, I was about to try and explain myself when the nurse began telling me the story. Turns out, that woman has been showing up for the past 5 years, every once in a month. Always at 2 a.m. sharp, she just comes to the door severely wounded and bleeding, and tries to get someone to open it for her. All medical staff is instructed to leave the counter and ignore her until she's gone. She apologized. Amidst the chaos, they'd forgotten I was still in the waiting room. I tried to ask why they never let her in, and the only explanation she had is that the one time she was let in, several doctors suffered serious injuries, and 2 died. After this harrowing tale, I was finally checked by a doctor. By then the cut had already scabbed, and it didn't need any stitches after all. I was still told to stay a bit longer inside the hospital though. They couldn't assure my safety if she was still roaming around. I looked outside and could see only darkness, but my stomach did a somersault. Yeah, I ended up missing the party. Story 2. Working in the ER isn't an easy job. I guess that's not a very bold claim. However, most of the time its difficulty doesn't come from the reasons one would normally expect. Sure, it's a job that requires a lot of knowledge and preparation, as well as very solid stress management and level-headedness. That on itself already makes it pretty difficult. However, I believe the hardest part is the human aspect of it. You're tending to complete strangers, most of whom you barely get to see their face before their life is thrust in your hands, and you're all that stands between this person and their demise. To claim it's a lot of pressure is to undersell it. Plus, you don't always get to save everyone. It's something really hard to grapple with, and often a lot of blame is placed on you, not only from the patient's friends and relatives, but in some cases, from the patients themselves. Let me tell you about one of those times. This happened back when I was just about to complete my 2nd year working in the ER. It was January 1st, 2015, New Year's Eve. In our line of work, you always have to pick between being free on Christmas or New Year's, and that year my mother-in-law had invited us to spend Christmas at hers. Therefore, I was right in the hospital, the clock having struck 12 just about an hour ago, and not a single cheer had been heard, as we were trying to save the life of a poor idiot who'd just had some fireworks blow up right in his face. We managed, fortunately, but he'd have lifelong deformities. Just another day at the job, I guess. We were catching a little break, eating some leftover Christmas cookies one of my colleagues had brought, when someone stumbled through the emergency doors. An old man, must have been in his 70s, slowly limped through the corridor, slurring and mumbling, trying to say something. We got up immediately, and just with a quick glance I could tell. His face was drooping, his words were slurring, his legs weren't working properly. This man was having a stroke. We quickly readied a rolling stretcher, got the man on it, and led him straight into the trauma exam room. We sprang right into action, giving him an immediate CT scan to figure out the next step. He was having a hemorrhagic stroke, which meant we have to perform immediate surgery to try and save his life. We began with some surgical clipping, but the hemorrhage was pretty advanced at this point. The only option we had was to attempt an AVM removal, which at this state would probably leave him with some brain damage. It was preferable to just letting him die. so we went for it. It wasn't successful. The stroke had been going on for too long, and his state was pretty critical. He'd come walking into the hospital all by himself. Who knows how long he'd held it together. He wasn't ever gonna make it. We removed the corpse and took him to the morgue, as one of the nurses went through his belongings to try and find someone to contact and inform of the man's passing. I stepped out to take a breather. It's never easy when someone dies under your care. And back then, with so less experience under my belt, it took an even heavier toll. My breather didn't last very much, because a few minutes later, I heard the doors swinging open once again, and had to spring back into action. As soon as I was back in, though, I stayed frozen in place, completely stunned. Someone that looked exactly like the same old man we'd just failed to save stood in the corridor, face drooping, speech slurred, and limping. I didn't know how to react, as the man kept on walking towards me. However, my medical instincts kicked in, and I went quickly to get a stretcher for him. I first tried to save this person, and then worry about the rest later. He couldn't be the same man. It just wasn't possible. He had to be someone else, similar looking, but someone different. The medics at the CT scan were as shocked as I was when they saw us walk in with the same exact man, but just as I'd done, they sprang into action almost immediately. The diagnosis was the exact same, hemorrhagic stroke. That had to be just a coincidence. As we rushed him to the operating room, I'd be getting the weirdest and most disturbing sense of déjà vu. As I began operating, I kept on trying to bury it and focus on the task at hand, but I was having a harder and harder time. Therefore, I decided I'd try something different this time, to see if this might save his life this time. Unfortunately, it did not, and after another failed emergency AVM removal, the man passed away again, and the same nurse rolled him away to the morgue. I let out a huge sigh, feeling almost relieved. All of us were extremely confused. Did this man have a twin brother? One that wore his same clothes and had the same type of stroke just a moment after his brother? We were still in the operating room, trying to make sense of it, as the nurse that was in charge of taking the corpse to the morgue came back, completely pale and shaking. She just said that the man we'd just lost before was gone. His corpse wasn't there anymore. We all stood in the operating room, stunned, trying to process what this meant, until we heard the doors swing open once again. All my hair stood on end as I heard the now familiar limp and slurred speech echo across the hall. I simply sprinted straight back into the operating room, closed the door, and told everyone to be quiet. We waited, hearing as the man's limps and moans got stronger and more desperate. My stomach dropped to my feet, and I could do nothing but wait until whatever thing that was out there would just leave us alone. He began screaming in his slurred speech, and I could sort of make out the words. "Why won't you help me?" he kept saying. A wave of guilt washed over me, but the fear managed to quell it. He stopped screaming, and all went quiet. We looked at one another, bewildered, and I slowly made my way out. There was no trace of him anymore. We reluctantly checked the morgue. No corpse was there either. We still have no explanation for it, nor do we seek one. I eventually learned these sorts of things aren't all that uncommon in this line of work. Everyone's got a story they can't explain. We don't linger on them, though. There are more urgent things at hand. Story 3. My childhood was spent in and out of hospitals. I was born very premature and had to spend almost the first month of my life in an incubator, stuck between life and death. Eventually, I managed to make it through, but unfortunately my lungs never developed quite properly. This led me to being very prompt to respiratory infections and asthmatic attacks, which had me walking into the ER about once every 2 months, and most times involved an overnight stay. Hospitals always try to give kids a pleasant experience. Children's rooms are often decorated with bright colors, despite being the place where tried to prevent your lungs from collapsing. You get where I'm coming from. No matter how hard they try, they'll never manage to be comforting or welcoming. It's not only about the places themselves, though. Sure, I mean, you'll never end up being quite fond of a place where you go every time your life is at risk. However, there's something else about them. I might not be religious, but hospitals sure are. Energetic. All those strong emotions and pain, those brusque transitions between life and death, all under the same roof. It's like a boiling pot. Things that go beyond us. They're bound to happen. As a kid, I didn't quite know what to make of them. They wouldn't show up every time I spent the night at the hospital, but when they did, they'd stay the entire night. These noises would be coming from the halls. They were like deep, long scratches on the tiled floor, echoing through the empty corridor. Along with them, this ragged, deep breathing. I'd tell my mom about it, but she could never hear them. She'd just tell me that it was probably some machine, or some doctors carrying something around the halls. Anything to appease my mind and help me fall asleep. I managed, eventually, but it'd always be this light, restless sleep, and I'd have these horrible dreams that'd have me waking up in a cold sweat. I can't remember them well. I just know they felt like dying. At least that's what I imagine it feels like. I began really dreading my hospital visits. I'd cry constantly when I'd have to spend the night, and I'd almost have no sleep at all. It became a big deal. I even started getting some light tranquilizers during my stays to help me sleep. I was taken to some child psychiatrists, and they figured I'd developed a version of PTSD due to my constant hospital visits. My parents did everything they could. They'd both tried to stay with me when I had to spend the night. They bought me a portable DVD player along with all my favorite movies to watch while I was there. Anything that they could to help me feel better. The noises would still be there, though. The noises, and the dreams, and the feeling of constant dread that come every other night. Nothing could be done against that. As I grew up, fortunately so did my lungs. The treatments I'd been given as a child had done their job. And even if I'd never have normal-sized lungs, I became much less prone to infections. Eventually, as long as I had an inhaler with me at all times, I could pretty much get by as a normal person. Sure, I had to avoid smoke and be careful around sick people all the time, but I didn't have to go to the hospital all the time anymore. I was free. Life went by. Eventually, the memories of those sleepless nights in hospitals faded. All that was left was a grown man who couldn't really explain his extreme apprehension for going to see the doctor when he felt sick. The times I caught the flu, and it got worse than it should have, I refused to go to the hospital. I got really lucky. Any of those times could have meant spontaneous lung collapse. I knew it, yet I could never manage to fight the repellence that the possibility of having to stay overnight provoked in me. It was unreasonable. And by the time I began trying to treat it with a therapist, it was too late. I managed to avoid COVID when it was most prominent, but eventually, on the winter of 2021, it finally caught up to me. I refused to go to the hospital. My girlfriend insisted, as did my parents, but I was sure that I'd just power through. Just as I'd done all those previous times. I was wrong. My lungs closed up, and I lost the ability to breathe. I had to be taken to the ER immediately. I recovered consciousness in a hospital room. I was lucky to be alive. However, I could only focus on the overwhelming dread that consumed me, that made my stomach shrivel up. It was nighttime, and I was lying down on an intensive care room, a mask of oxygen tied around my face. I looked around, panicked. I was completely and utterly alone. From the hallway, I heard big, heavy claws scratching the tiled floor, along with a ragged, deep breathing. I gasped. The memories came straight back. The claws began getting closer and closer, and I could hear the breathing right outside my door. I tried to move, but my whole body was completely paralyzed. I watched as my door slowly opened. I tried to close my eyes, but I just couldn't. A creature slid inside the room, closing the door behind it. Its face drooped, stuck on an eternal grimace of despair, mouth agape, just empty voids where the eyes should have been. Its arms, too long for its body, dragged across the floor, its gigantic claws scratching the floor as it made its way towards me. It approached until it stood right next to me, staring with those empty eyes, its ragged breathing almost in my ear. Then, it just stood there. It said nothing. It did nothing. It just remained, observing. My heart rate went through the roof, and a nurse eventually burst into the room to check on me. She couldn't see it, so it stayed. I couldn't talk or scream, so the nurse briefly checked my vitals and left. I spent a week inside the hospital, and the creature never left my side. It was the longest week of my life. I still don't know what they are, or why only I can see them. There's only one thing I'm sure of. Next time my lungs fail me, I won't go to the hospital. I'll rather just die. Thanks for watching. If you like the stories, remember to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any other true disturbing stories. See you next video.